I traveled with my sister to the Fuji Caves a couple of years ago. It's in Honshu, Japan, and is part of Aokigahara Forest. It means blue tree meadow in Japanese, but it's known for more than its haunting beauty. I think they even made a movie about it. It's a really important part of Japanese history and mythology. It's also home to yurei. This might be an extreme oversimplification of the word, but it basically means fated spirit, ghosts. My sister was teaching in Tokyo, and it was always a dream of mine to visit her there. We made the arrangements, and she rented a car. She wanted to go to the countryside, so we spent the whole day exploring caves, but around 4 in the afternoon the guide said it was time to leave. There was a huge storm coming. We got into the car and started driving to our hotel. From there, we could easily go to the 2 other caves the next day. Just as we got to the main road, there was a massive lightning strike. And it immediately started to rain really hard. We could barely see out of the windows. My sister was driving. She was more familiar with the country and was always a much better driver than me anyway, so she followed the GPS closely. But when the voice said to turn, we realized that we were lost. We found ourselves on a tiny road surrounded by trees. We reset the GPS, but when it came back on, it said we were out in the middle of nowhere. No roads were in our location. I zoomed in and saw that the spot was in the middle of the forest, which was impossible because there are no roads in the forest. Trails, yes, but definitely no paved roads. Then that little question mark popped up on the GPS, and the screen went black. We were on a road that should not exist, with no GPS, in the middle of a storm. Something slammed into the car. In the headlights, through the pouring rain, we saw a figure with long, black, tangled hair. So long it was almost wrapped up in it. The dress or sheet it was wearing was soaking wet, and it was clinging to its gray flesh in certain places. The wind was so hard it was blowing it around. It looked like someone had left laundry hanging on the line during a tornado. I'll never forget that. I was like, is this a joke? Was it an escaped lunatic? It was too tall to be a person. My sister was generally very level-headed, but she was freaking out. It was like we were kids again, and I wanted to protect her, but I was just as scared as she was. I told my sister to let me drive. As soon as I said that, the thing, whatever it was, disappeared. I told her to climb into the back seat, and then I could move over to the driver's side. I guess without thinking, she just got out of the car. I screamed at her to get back in, but the figure appeared behind her out of nowhere, snatched her by the legs, and dragged her into the forest. Without thinking, I jumped out and went after her, screaming at the thing to leave her alone. They found me in the forest the next day, soaking wet and crying and out of my mind. No sign of the car, no sign of the road, no sign of my sister. I'm 47 and father of 2 boys. My wife and I have been together for almost 20 years. I have to travel frequently for my job. Some people enjoy traveling for work, but I don't. A couple of weeks ago, I had to go to Cleveland for a meeting. Too far for me to drive, so my wife took me to the airport on a Monday morning. I checked my luggage in, got my boarding pass, and went to the lounge for coffee while I waited. I kept a close eye on the board so I wouldn't miss my flight. But when it was about 10 minutes to boarding time, it suddenly showed that the flight had been delayed. Of course, I was immediately annoyed since I had meetings that afternoon. I wanted to get to the hotel first to drop off my stuff and freshen up a little bit. I gathered my things and walked over to the help desk. The lady behind the counter said it must have been an error because business class passengers were already starting to board the plane. Now I was really annoyed. I thanked her and ran to the gate. As I was boarding, I saw that the other passengers all looked a little confused. I heard one guy talking on his phone, saying that the airline was incompetent and almost made him miss his flight. At least I hadn't been the only one. I didn't ask anyone about it. I prefer to keep to myself. I got to my seat and settled in, took out my laptop and went to work. It's easy to put away during takeoff, so it was no hassle. As I was typing away, I suddenly felt a massive jolt. I looked out the window and saw the plane had started taxiing. Strange. No welcome message from the captain, no attendant in sight. I knew something was wrong. A passenger got up and walked to the front, and one of the attendants appeared suddenly. She whispered something to him, then looked up and smiled, the most unnerving, phony smile that I've ever seen. At that moment, she looked like she was literally made of plastic. It was like the smile of a doll. She disappeared behind the curtain, and the bell sounded with the little icon above us to let passengers know it's time to fasten our seatbelts. No emergency demonstration, and no word from the pilot. No attendants walking down the aisle to check on us. Nothing. It was strange. Then, as the plane started down the runway, I saw a huge, swirling black cloud outside my window. It was a murder of crows. It was a huge black wave in the sky, like all the crows in the world had converged at that moment, and they were heading right for the plane. Next thing I knew, they were flying right alongside the plane as we were moving. People were screaming, pointing, taking pictures with their phones. Then the whole plane started shaking, almost like we were experiencing turbulence in the air, but worse. Much, much worse. It felt like the plane was going to break up, but we were still on the runway. I was like, what the hell is happening? It was like a nightmare. Next thing I knew, everyone on the plane went quiet. No screaming, no crying, nothing. Total silence. I looked around and everyone was frozen in place, but had the same look as the flight attendant had earlier. That same phony plastic smile on every one of their faces. Their eyes were clouded over like curdled milk. I gripped the arms of my seat. I closed my eyes, thinking about my wife. At least I said goodbye and told her I loved her. Then, suddenly the plane turned to the side sharply. The engines died down. It was almost like coming up for air after being submerged in the water. The sounds of the world and the screaming of the passengers returned. I felt movement all around me. Just as I opened my eyes, the whole plane lurched forward. It was pure chaos after my nightmare or whatever that had been. Kids were screaming, people crying, panic everywhere. When it was my turn to go down the emergency slide, I saw the nose of the airplane, the damage to the wing. I felt lucky to be alive. I remember seeing the cops and the paramedics taking one of the pilots away on a stretcher. But just before they loaded him into the ambulance, I could have sworn I saw him smiling at me, just as a crow's feather passed in front of my eyes and blew away. Normally when I travel, I just take a backpack and travel on foot, or maybe take the occasional cab when I travel abroad. I want to at least try to get an authentic experience of whatever country I'm visiting. I get to meet the locals, eat at places where the tourists don't normally go, sometimes even crashing at one of the locals' houses. That's a thing I've done. You know, the truly immersive experience. But 2 years ago, I booked a tour through a travel agent. My mom wanted to travel with me, and I couldn't ask her to travel like I do. I'm a professional photographer for an entertainment company, that's all I'll say. So it's always a working holiday when I do this stuff. When they found out that I was going through a travel agent, they decided to make the focal point of their story about arranged travel. It was Mexico for this particular trip. A few days before we left, my mom got sick and had to cancel. She mentioned I should ask my girlfriend at the time, but there wasn't enough time to make all the necessary arrangements. So ultimately, I ended up going alone anyway. I got on a plane for Mexico City. Next stop on the agenda was supposed to be a small town in the middle of nowhere. There were 2 buses. The first half of the trip on the first bus was bumpy and slightly uncomfortable, but otherwise uneventful. While we were waiting for the transfer backup bus to arrive to take us the rest of the way, I remember it was really hot. I had asked for a more rugged experience. I also remember it was very windy, and it was starting to get late. The van arrived, and I was trying to be a gentleman and courteous and let everyone else get on board first. A gust of wind came up, and my hat flew off my head. I ran to grab it. The van took off without me. At first I thought it was a joke. Then I realized, no joke. They had driven off and left me in the middle of nowhere, Mexico. I just started walking, hoping someone would drive by, or maybe the van would turn around and realize what they had done and pick me up. It was dark now, and I was lost. I'd been walking for a while when I suddenly heard growling off to my right. It was like a wolf or a huge dog, but I couldn't be sure. Now, I've had my share of adventures, you might say, but something didn't sound right about this animal. It was getting closer, and I didn't like it. As I peered into the dark, there was just enough moonlight for me to see a huge animal slowly coming towards me. It looked like something that should have been on all fours, but it wasn't. It had these spiky hairs or something sticking out of its back, like you see on a wild pig. A horrible smell hit my nose, like decomposing flesh. I picked up my pace, but I was afraid to walk too fast and make too much noise. I was a sitting duck out there. The next thing I knew, I heard a howling sound. Well, it really wasn't a howling. It was more like a mixture of a pig squealing with a sick dog and a human scream. I'll never be able to unhear it. I heard it running on the dry desert ground, and I knew it was headed straight for me. I just started running up the road. Then, out of nowhere, I saw headlights coming up on the other side of the road. I frantically started waving them down, but they'd already seen me, and they were starting to slow down. The driver and the travel guide probably thought I was going to severely hurt both of them for leaving me behind or sue the company or something, but I just ran up to the van, laughing and crying like a crazy person. They started to get out, but I screamed at the top of my lungs for them to stay in the van. Once I got in, I kept screaming at them to just drive away. The driver hit the gas. I hugged them both, still laughing and crying. I tried to explain what had happened to the guide. He looked at me like he felt sorry for me or something, but the driver had this look on his face. He wasn't surprised at all. To this day, I still don't know what happened to me out there. If you thought these stories were scary, then make sure you watch this next video here if you really want to be scared.